June 1st, 2019. Saturday. Mason slowly regained consciousness. His head throbbed with a sharp, unrelenting pain, and his body felt drained and weak. Darkness engulfed him completely, a void so profound it seemed to swallow him whole. When he tried to move, Mason quickly realized he couldn't. Several futile attempts only heightened his anxiety. He was tied up. Thick ropes tightly bound his arms and legs, pinning him firmly against a cold, hard surface beneath him. He could feel something covering his face. A slick fabric, tightly fastened, blocked out all light and painfully pressed against his temples, making the veins in his head throb with every heartbeat. His thoughts raced chaotically as his mind struggled to make sense of the situation. Taking a shallow breath, Mason caught a whiff of something familiar, a pungent blend of chemicals and dampness that triggered memories of how he had ended up here. The air was heavy with the stench of mold and mildew, mixed with a harsh cocktail of cleaning chemicals, likely bleach, and a sickly sweet undertone of decay. The oppressive smell made his stomach churn. Mason realized he was in the basement lab of the madman Gabriel, the one obsessed with reviving his deceased brother. The weight of his predicament pressed down on him. He stifled a cry, biting down hard to silence himself. A sound broke the heavy silence, the slow, shuffling steps of someone approaching from the far end of the room. It was Gabriel, moving with his characteristic uneven gait, each step filled with a dreadful intent. Mason's skin prickled as a cold sweat broke out over his body. A chill ran down his spine, and his breathing quickened with panic. The thought that this could be the end sent his mind spiraling. Would death come swiftly, or would it be drawn out and excruciating? Moments later, Gabriel's gloved hand reached out and yanked the blindfold off Mason's face. "Oh, you're awake," Gabriel drawled, his voice laced with a sinister glee. "Just lying there all quiet. I've been waiting." Mason squinted as a bright, round surgical lamp beamed directly into his face. The harsh yellow light burned his retinas, forcing him to blink rapidly. It was an outdated lamp, the kind used by dentists or surgeons decades ago, with thick glass and an almost unnatural glow that made Mason's head spin. Just beyond the blinding light loomed Gabriel's face. The man's deeply lined features were partially hidden behind a stained medical mask, but his piercing eyes burned with an unsettling fervor. They studied Mason with an intensity that made his skin crawl. After a moment, Gabriel reached beneath the table and pulled out a blood-streaked scalpel, which he began to trace lightly across Mason's cheek. "Ah, such smooth, youthful skin," Gabriel mused, his tone unnervingly calm. "Your age, your vitality. Yes, your energy will do nicely." Mason's heart pounded in his chest as the cold blade grazed his skin. His senses snapped into focus. As his eyes adjusted to the light, he cautiously turned his head to the left, scanning his surroundings. He was lying on a hard metal table, like one you'd see in a morgue. But unlike a standard slab, this one was draped with a thin sheet. His wrists and ankles were strapped down with black leather restraints, not ropes as he had first thought. The room was a spacious basement with tiled walls, each covered in strange, hand-scratched symbols that seemed to pulsate in the dim light. The floor was lined with plastic sheeting, some sections marred by dark, dried stains that could only be blood. Around him stood shelves filled with glass jars, worn books, and an array of bizarre instruments. Near one corner of the room, several doors led to what Mason could only assume were other sections of the basement. None of them looked inviting. "Well, now that you're awake, let's check on your little friend," Gabriel said abruptly, turning away from Mason. Mason shifted his head to the right and froze. Next to him was another identical table, and on it lay Mia, her eyes covered with the same kind of blindfold Mason had just been freed from. A pang of guilt and terror struck Mason like a bolt of lightning. He blamed himself for dragging Mia into this nightmare. If only he'd made different choices, this green-eyed girl with her charming dimples would be safe at home or hanging out with friends, not lying helpless under the scalpel of a madman with blood on his hands. Gabriel ripped the blindfold off Mia's face, but she didn't stir. "What are you going to do with us?" Mason croaked, summoning every ounce of strength he had left. Gabriel's lips curled into a chilling smile. "Do with you?" "Oh, nothing too complicated. You're simply here to assist me with a particular goal of mine. It's rare that such prime specimens come to me willingly." His tone was dripping with mockery. Gabriel began lightly tapping the scalpel against Mia's face, as if testing her skin. Mason's stomach twisted. The old man seemed to be calculating his next move, his bony fingers brushing against Mia's cheek. Gabriel slapped Mia's face a few times, trying to rouse her, but she remained unconscious. "Ah, perhaps I overdid it with the dosage," Gabriel muttered with a dry chuckle, scrutinizing her limp form. Mason's heart raced as he watched, powerless to intervene. His body was so drained that even blinking felt like an effort. A storm of fear, guilt, and helplessness churned inside him, threatening to overwhelm him entirely. "Well, enough fooling around. Time to get to work," Gabriel announced, pushing a small rolling cart laden with tools and a bowl of murky water closer to Mia's table. Mason watched in horror as Gabriel rummaged through the metal instruments and pulled out a long, curved surgical saw. Without hesitation, the old man brought it close to Mia's neck. "No, no! What are you doing?" Mason croaked, summoning every ounce of strength. Gabriel responded with a chilling laugh. "Relax, kid." "Just kidding," Gabriel said, placing the saw back on the table. Instead, he picked up a small syringe filled with a translucent green liquid. He brought it to Mia's neck and carefully injected the needle into a prominent vein. "There we go. Now, we wait." Within moments, Mia's body jerked, and her eyes flew open as she gasped loudly, startling Mason. "Ah, much better," Gabriel commented, leaning over Mia's face. "So, what brought you two here?" We were investigating," Mason replied weakly. "Investigating? Of course, you were," Gabriel said, pulling Mason's backpack from under the table. "You kids have come a long way, and for what? You know, many have tried to catch me over the years, but no one's gotten as close as you two. I like that. So, I've got something special planned for you." Mason listened in horror as Mia slowly regained awareness, squinting against the harsh light of the lamp. Meanwhile, Gabriel sorted through his old tools, pulling out a scalpel and rinsing it in murky water, a disturbing attempt at sterilization. Gabriel unbuttoned Mia's shirt halfway and ran his hand over her collarbone. The scalpel glinted in his hand as he abruptly brought it close to her chest. A jolt of panic surged through Mason, filling him with a desperate strength. He began thrashing against the restraints, shouting at Gabriel to let Mia go. She lay motionless, breathing heavily, her eyes vacant and emotions dulled. Gabriel ignored Mason's cries and turned to one of the shelves, retrieving a nameless book. Flipping it open, he returned to Mia's side. Without hesitation, he began to chant in an unfamiliar language, its guttural and melodic sounds vaguely reminiscent of Latin but laced with strange, incomprehensible syllables. Despite Mason's desperate screams, Gabriel pressed the scalpel against Mia's skin, making a precise, deliberate incision. Pain shot through Mia's body, but when she tried to scream, only a strangled gasp and bubbling noise escaped her throat. Gabriel's chants grew louder as the room's fluorescent light flickered ominously. The air turned frigid and oppressive, while Mason's cries went unanswered. With clinical precision, Gabriel etched a mystical symbol into Mia's chest. Her muffled cries echoed in the room, but Gabriel remained detached, his movements mechanical and precise despite his advanced age. When he finished, he threw a dirty cloth onto Mia's chest and pressed it down firmly. "That's done. Now it's your turn, boy," Gabriel said, circling the table to stand over Mason. Mason's heart raced wildly as terror overtook him. His mind reeled at the thought of what was about to happen. He fought against his restraints with all his strength, but they held fast. Gabriel sliced through Mason's shirt with a swift motion, exposing his chest. After rinsing the scalpel in the same murky water, he brought it to Mason's skin. Chanting clearly and deliberately, Gabriel began carving a matching symbol onto Mason's body. Mason screamed, his voice hoarse, as the pain became unbearable. The leather straps pinned him down, and he could do nothing but endure the torment. The air thickened with a rancid odor as dust swirled in the dim light. Shadows danced along the walls, creating an eerie, otherworldly atmosphere. Minutes felt like hours as Gabriel worked methodically. Mason's body trembled with exhaustion, and his vision blurred with tears. His ears rang, and the only sounds were Gabriel's chants and the faint whimpers of Mia. When Gabriel finished, he pressed a filthy rag against Mason's chest and stepped back. Mason lay motionless, his energy completely drained. His mind teetered on the edge of unconsciousness as he tried to block out the horror of their situation. Gabriel wiped his hands and placed the scalpel back on the tray. Without a word, he rolled the tray aside and left the room through a side door, disappearing into the darkness beyond. "Mia, are you okay?" Mason whispered, his voice trembling. I think so. But I can't feel my arms or legs," she replied weakly. "I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. I never should have brought you here." "It's too late for apologies," Mia said, her voice faltering. "We need to figure out how to get out of here." She winced as the pain from her wound flared, cutting her words short. Their whispered exchange was interrupted by the creak of a door. Gabriel had returned, his shadow stretching across the room. Gabriel entered the room, pushing two old, rusty wheelchairs equipped with leather straps on the armrests and near the footrests. Approaching Mia, Gabriel unfastened the straps securing her to the table and lifted her limp body into one of the wheelchairs. He secured her tightly with the straps, though it seemed unnecessary. Both teenagers were too weak to resist. He repeated the process with Mason, lifting him into the second wheelchair and fastening him in. Gabriel then began pushing the wheelchairs toward the door. As they moved closer, Mason and Mia saw that it led to a long, dimly lit corridor. "Where are you taking us? Let us go." "We won't tell anyone about this," Mia pleaded. "I'm giving you a little tour," Gabriel replied, his voice calm and even, devoid of the earlier madness. "I'll show you where you'll be staying and bring you up to speed on how things work here." Gabriel's tone was unsettlingly composed, as if he were a rational man. It made Mason's skin crawl. "I've looked through your belongings, Mason, so I assume you already know a bit about me," Gabriel continued. "I've been alone for years. The only thing keeping me going is my mission to bring my brother back to life. And I'm close. Very close. My rituals and experiments have brought me to the brink of success. Soon, I'll achieve my goal." They reached the end of the corridor. To their right were three heavy wooden doors. Gabriel opened the first, revealing a small, damp, and dimly lit room. On the floor lay a filthy mattress, where two disheveled middle-aged men huddled together. Their hollow eyes and unkempt appearances made them look like shadows of their former selves. The room was littered with trash, rags, and bones. Mason shuddered to think where the bones might have come from. Gabriel shut the door with a loud bang and wheeled the teenagers to the next room. Inside, they saw a man lying on the floor and a woman sitting against the wall, staring blankly ahead. Her vacant eyes showed no recognition of their presence. The sight of these broken individuals weighed heavily on Mason's conscience. He couldn't stop himself from imagining the horrors they must have endured. At the third door, Gabriel opened it to reveal an empty room. He pushed the wheelchairs inside one at a time. "This will be your new home," Gabriel announced. "Your youthful energy will be essential for my final ritual to revive my brother. For now, you'll work with me and follow my orders. I'll be honest, as long as you cooperate, you'll stay alive. Unlike your neighbors, who are just homeless and sick individuals I've captured for experiments, you two have a greater purpose. You know my story and my plans, so you'll be more useful to me." Gabriel's tone grew darker. "Don't even think about escape. The symbols carved into your chests are powerful magic. They're bound to me and controlled by dark forces. The moment you speak, plan, or even think about escape or disobedience, the symbols will cause you unbearable pain. So, keep your thoughts in check and your mouth shut. Understood? Mason and Mia stared at Gabriel, too frightened to respond. Mia couldn't bring herself to speak, the weight of Gabriel's words had shattered her hope. "You won't kill us?" Mason finally asked. "I've already told you, no," Gabriel said. "As long as you listen and do what I say, you'll be fine." Mason locked eyes with Gabriel, his fear beginning to give way to a cold clarity. He could see the deceit hidden behind the old man's composed demeanor. Gabriel abruptly turned and left the room. A few minutes later, he returned with 2 plates of food, buckwheat and beef from a can. He placed the plates on the floor, unfastened their straps, and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Darkness enveloped the room. Mason fumbled for the plates and handed one to Mia. The teenagers ate in silence, scooping the food with their hands. Once finished, they moved to the mattress in the corner of the room. Too drained to talk, they simply lay down and held each other. Mason's mind swirled with guilt. This was far from the future he had envisioned with Mia. He had dreamed of carefree summer nights and the blossoming of their relationship, not this, trapped in a dark, damp basement. He held her tightly, trying to convey his regret through his actions. Her hair still carried the faint scent of shampoo, mingled with the musty smell of mold, old concrete, and blood. For Mason, Mia's presence was both a comfort and a torment. While her closeness gave him a sliver of hope, his guilt gnawed at him relentlessly. Mia, on the other hand, felt a constant urge to escape. Thoughts of freedom flared in her mind, each one triggering a sharp pain from the symbol on her chest. She forced herself to suppress these impulses, knowing the consequences of disobedience. Despite everything, Mia didn't blame Mason. She had volunteered to help him from the beginning, and she didn't see him as responsible for their predicament. His warmth and the weight of his arm around her shoulder gave her strength. Deep down, she believed that together, they could find a way out of this nightmare. Her feelings for Mason only grew stronger in the face of their shared ordeal. June 2nd, 2019. Sunday. The first morning in their new prison caught the teenagers off guard. They woke to the loud banging of fists on the door. It was Gabriel, delivering another meal. Determining the exact time was impossible. The basement lacked windows or clocks, leaving them to guess at the hour. Hours later, the door to their room suddenly swung open, and a beam of harsh light sliced through the darkness. Gabriel shone a flashlight directly into Mason's face, studying him intently. "Enough sitting around. Get up. Today, you'll start your first task." Mason rose cautiously and helped Mia to her feet. After a night on the cold, hard mattress, their bodies ached, their legs felt numb, and every step sent pins and needles through their limbs. The symbols carved into their chests occasionally throbbed with pain, a sharp reminder of their ordeal. Despite the passage of the night, the wounds remained fresh, showing no signs of healing. In the dim hallway, Mason supported Mia as she stumbled beside him. Her steps were shaky, and she leaned on him heavily for balance. "Follow me," Gabriel commanded, shuffling toward the main room. As they passed the other rooms, Mia heard faint groans coming from behind one of the doors. The sound sent a shiver through her, reigniting memories of the horrors they had witnessed. The main room looked much the same as the day before, except the tables in the center were now covered with fresh linens, devoid of the bloodstains and remnants of the previous day's atrocities. "Sit," Gabriel ordered. Resistance was pointless. The teens complied, with Mason helping Mia onto one of the tables before sitting on the other himself. "Considering your experience breaking into places, your task is this. At Lusher Charter School, there's a chemistry lab. In the supply room, they keep chemicals, formaldehyde, and a few other substances. Tonight, you will break into the school and retrieve the items on this list." Gabriel handed Mason a yellowed piece of notebook paper, the kind that looked like it belonged in a bygone era. Written in blocky, uneven handwriting was a list of unrecognizable chemical names. But before I let you go, there's one more thing. Gabriel turned and wheeled over a familiar tray of instruments. He selected a large, metal syringe with a cloudy glass barrel and wide, circular grips for fingers. Its oversized needle glistened ominously, a red liquid dripping from its tip. The sight alone was enough to send a wave of terror through Mason. "Give me your arm." Mason stared at the syringe, cold sweat trickling down his back. His body froze with fear. Mia, surprisingly calm, extended her arm without hesitation. After the ritual from the night before, a simple injection seemed almost trivial to her. Gabriel grabbed Mason's wrist and injected the fluid into his arm, then repeated the process with Mia. "This liquid will slowly weaken you. It acts over 7 hours. You'll have the whole night to complete your mission, but if you don't return in time, you won't receive the antidote and you'll die. So don't waste time. And remember the symbols. Any thought or action of escape will bring you unbearable pain. Now, follow me." Mason glanced at his arm. A small red mark remained where the needle had pierced his skin. To his surprise, he felt invigorated. His energy returned, and his mind became clearer. Mia experienced the same surge of vitality, the effects of the injection working instantly. Gabriel led them to a second set of doors, previously locked. From his pocket, he retrieved a ring of keys and unlocked them. Behind the doors was another corridor, longer than the one they had just left. Its far end disappeared into darkness. "That's your way out. At the end is the exit. Use it to return the same way." Gabriel handed Mason a flashlight and gave them a firm push into the corridor. As soon as the teenagers stepped through, the heavy doors slammed shut behind them, echoing ominously in the silence. "What now?" "This seems like our chance," Mason said, but as soon as the words left his mouth, he dropped to his knees, writhing in pain. "Are you okay?" Mia crouched beside him, realizing what had happened. The symbol on her chest began to burn as well, and she fought to push away thoughts of escape. "No, nothing's okay. This is a nightmare. We're doomed, and it's all my fault," Mason choked out, tears streaming down his face as he remained hunched on the floor. Even though Gabriel had pointed them toward the exit, they couldn't flee. The mere thought of escape triggered searing pain that felt like it was ripping through their bodies. Mason's emotions overwhelmed him, constant pressure from Gabriel, the hopelessness of their situation, the dark forces controlling them, and his overwhelming guilt all crushed his resolve. Despair consumed him with every passing second. Mia wrapped her arms tightly around Mason, stroking his back gently as she whispered comforting words in his ear. She knew that not all hope was lost. Despite the unimaginable challenges ahead, she held on to the belief that they could still find a way out. She was determined to keep Mason from giving up. The symbol on her chest pulsed with pain, but she gritted her teeth and endured it. She hadn't expected to be the one offering comfort in such a harrowing situation, but Mason had become her anchor. Her words, though simple, carried a weight that any writer would envy. Yet, despite her efforts, Mason's despair only deepened. He sat on the floor, clutching his knees, consumed by his emotions. "No, Mia, I can't do this," he whispered before collapsing onto the ground. The pain from the symbol flared again, and he broke into uncontrollable sobs. Any thoughts of escape or refusal to follow Gabriel's orders brought an unbearable agony. His mental state crumbled further as his sobs echoed down the corridor. The flashlight Mason had been holding slipped from his grasp, leaving the already dark corridor even gloomier. His cries reverberated off the walls, fading into the distance. "Enough, Mason. Please, get up," Mia urged, her voice steady yet filled with urgency. "The longer we stay here, the worse it'll get. Let's at least try. We can do this." After several more minutes of Mia's coaxing, Mason's sobs subsided, and he finally managed to stand. Together, they moved slowly down the corridor. Mason read the list Gabriel had given them aloud. Lusher Charter School. 3rd floor. Chemistry lab. Storage room. Chemicals, formaldehyde, calcium chloride, ferric sulfate, potassium nitrate, and red phosphorus. I can see why he'd want formaldehyde, but calcium chloride? Mia mused. It's used to absorb moisture, but judging by the humidity in that basement, he's definitely not using it for that. I don't know, Mason replied. Maybe it's part of the preparation process for the body before it goes into the formaldehyde bath. The red phosphorus worries me more. You don't think he's planning to blow up the lab, do you? Let's hope that's not the case, Mia said quietly. In the faint beam of the flashlight, they spotted the end of the tunnel. It was a dead end, seemingly without an exit. But upon closer inspection, they found uneven grooves carved into the wall on the right, leading upward. The ceiling above had a wooden hatch instead of concrete. All right, I'll go first, Mason said, handing the flashlight to Mia before carefully climbing up. After a few moments, his hand brushed against the wooden panel of the hatch. Dirt, twigs, and dried leaves spilled onto him as he pushed the hatch open, muttering a quiet curse. The square opening revealed the night sky, scattered with stars. Fresh air flooded in, and Mason took a deep breath, feeling momentarily dizzy. The cool, crisp forest air was a stark contrast to the dusty, moldy confines of the basement. He continued climbing and pulled himself out. Once he was clear, Mia tossed him the flashlight and followed. Together, they stood under the open sky, taking in their first real breath of freedom. For a few moments, the teenagers stood still, holding hands, savoring the fleeting sense of peace. It was as if, for a brief moment, they could forget their perilous situation and believe that everything would be all right. After standing silently for a few minutes, they began to survey their surroundings. The area was familiar, a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of New Orleans, where narrow streets met a small wooded area. They had spent their childhood playing here, never suspecting the horrors hidden beneath their feet. Wasting no time, Mason carefully made his way through the dense foliage, clearing a path for Mia and holding back larger branches. Orienting himself quickly, he visualized the quickest route to the school. It wasn't far, and the dead of night cloaked the streets in eerie silence. The roads were deserted, whether by coincidence or Gabriel's interference. The teenagers didn't encounter a single person. The school, a sprawling 3-story brick building, loomed ominously under the moonlight. Mason had never seen a school at night, much less one as unfamiliar as this. The subtle differences from Jefferson High unnerved him. The darkened windows seemed to watch them, and Mason couldn't shake the feeling of unseen eyes tracking their movements. Circling the building, the teens noticed a faint glow in one of the windows on the 1st floor. It was the guard's office, situated next to the main entrance. We can't use the main entrance. Let's try the side stairs, Mason whispered, pulling Mia back into the shadows. Along one of the school's walls, they found an exterior staircase leading to a small balcony. From there, they had 2 options: a door leading into the gymnasium or a ladder extending up to the roof. Deciding to try the gymnasium door first, Mason tested the handle. To his surprise, it was unlocked. This unexpected stroke of luck felt suspicious, as if Gabriel had anticipated their every move. Inside, the gymnasium echoed with the faint sound of their footsteps as they crossed to a nearby corridor. Moving cautiously, they searched for the stairs to the 3rd floor, where Gabriel had said the chemistry lab was located. At the first junction, they spotted a stairwell and ascended quietly, their movements nearly soundless. On the 3rd floor, they read the labels on the doors: physics lab, geography, mathematics. Here it is, Mason said softly, spotting the sign for the chemistry lab. He turned the handle, and the door creaked open. They slipped inside. At the back of the classroom, another door led to the supply room. Navigating carefully past desks and chairs, they entered the smaller room and began searching. Mason pulled out the list Gabriel had given him and methodically scanned the shelves, tables, and windowsills crowded with jars and containers. After what felt like an eternity, they located the required chemicals. They stuffed the items into their pockets, their hands trembling with urgency. As Mason approached the door to the corridor, he suddenly recoiled, clutching his chest in pain. The symbol carved into his chest burned fiercely, forcing him back. Moments later, footsteps echoed in the hallway, and a flashlight beam swept under the door. "The guard's doing his rounds," Mia whispered, pulling Mason under a desk. The footsteps grew louder, the flashlight beam skittering across the gap beneath the door. Nearby, another door creaked as the guard checked a neighboring classroom. The guard's steps stopped directly outside the chemistry lab. Mason and Mia held their breath, their hearts pounding as they waited. Time seemed to stretch endlessly until, finally, the footsteps resumed and faded down the hallway. Exhaling in relief, they crawled out from under the desk. Mason crept to the door and pressed his ear against it. The hallway was silent. He opened the door cautiously, scanning the corridor. At the far end, he spotted a ladder leading up to an attic hatch. "That might be our best way out," Mason murmured, motioning for Mia to follow. Near the ladder stood the guard, holding a rope with a noose tied at one end. The man was attempting to secure it to the top rung of the ladder. Mason froze in horror, watching the scene unfold. Fear paralyzed him. He didn't know how to react. On one hand, he felt compelled to intervene and stop the guard from his apparent intention. But doing so would expose them, making it impossible to return to Gabriel and obtain the antidote. Worse still, the burning reminder of the symbol on his chest warned him against any deviation from the plan. His thoughts raced chaotically as the man tied the rope and climbed the ladder. Suddenly, Mia gave Mason a sharp shove on his shoulder. Her frightened eyes darted from him to the man on the ladder. "Run!" Mason whispered urgently, grabbing her hand and bolting in the opposite direction toward the stairwell. They descended the stairs quietly but quickly, ears straining for any sound. Suddenly, they heard the sharp slip of the guard's shoes against the ladder. Mia gasped, her eyes welling with tears. A sense of helplessness weighed heavily on both teenagers, adding yet another burden to their already fractured psyches. Without stopping, they fled the school and sprinted through the deserted streets toward the wooded area where Gabriel's laboratory entrance lay hidden. June 3rd, 2019. Monday. Physically and mentally exhausted, the teenagers reached the entrance at dawn. The sky was beginning to lighten, though the sun was not yet visible. Dew formed on the grass, and the air carried the refreshing crispness of a summer morning. In contrast to the serene natural beauty, descending into the grim and desolate basement was the last thing they wanted to do. Yet with every passing moment, the teens felt worse, the poison was taking effect, and time to receive the antidote was running out. With heavy hearts and a sense of dread, Mason began descending into the tunnel. Mia followed, carefully closing the hatch behind her before jumping down, where Mason caught her in a steadying embrace. Their journey to the laboratory was silent, each was lost in their thoughts. The night's encounter with the guard had left a deep emotional scar on both of them. After a moment, Mason knocked on the laboratory door. When no response came, he pushed it open, and it gave way easily. The hallway was bathed in light spilling out from the main room. Exhausted and hoping for an end to their ordeal, the teenagers were unprepared for the horror that awaited them inside. They found Gabriel mid-experiment. In the center of the room, on the same table Mason had been strapped to earlier, was the body of a man they had seen in one of the holding rooms. The man's arms and legs were restrained, and he was naked. Wires connected his body to a crude control panel on a rolling cart. Unlike the first table of surgical tools, this one was laden with circuit boards, buttons, blinking lights, and levers, all connected by tangled, exposed wires leading to the man. The teens watched in horror as Gabriel began activating his device. One by one, he pressed buttons, and the lights blinked to life. Electrical impulses shot through the man's body, causing him to convulse violently. The semi-conscious man gasped and gurgled, too weak to resist or cry out. Suddenly, the device sputtered, its lights flickering erratically, and a large red warning light illuminated on the control panel. Gabriel cursed under his breath and switched off the system, but it was too late for the man on the table. Paralyzed with fear, Mason and Mia stood frozen. Goosebumps covered their skin, and cold sweat dripped down their faces. Mason's flashlight slipped from his grasp, and Mia leaned against the wall for support, her legs trembling. Gabriel fiddled with the controls and restarted the machine. The lights blinked again, the wires hummed with energy, and the man's body convulsed once more. Gabriel's intent was clear. He was attempting to revive the man using electrical impulses. After several unsuccessful attempts, he gave up, pulling the large lever to shut off the system completely. He unhooked the wires, then lifted the limp body onto his shoulders and carried it across the room. In the corner stood a large cylinder covered with a tarp. Gabriel pulled back the tarp, revealing a tank filled with bright green liquid. Without hesitation, he dumped the body into the tank and covered it again. Only then did he turn and notice the teenagers standing in stunned silence. "Ah, just in time," Gabriel said with a twisted grin. "Hope you enjoyed the show. As you can see, I'm working on disrupting and restoring the nervous system with electrical impulses. It worked last time, but not today. The system couldn't handle the power. Needs more fine-tuning." What did you do with the body?" Mason stammered, his voice shaking. "Oh, don't worry about that. It's acid. I dissolve all the waste in there," Gabriel said nonchalantly. "Now, enough questions. Hand over the chemicals." With trembling hands, the teenagers emptied their pockets and handed over the jars of chemicals to the deranged scientist. "Good work. You got everything I asked for. Now, back to your room. And remember, you're mine," Gabriel said, clenching his fist menacingly. At that moment, the symbols on their chests flared with searing pain, a cruel reminder of their captivity. June 4th, 2019. Tuesday. That morning, Mason and Mia were not woken by anyone. They awoke almost simultaneously, lying on the same old mattress in the corner of the room. The door was ajar, and light filtered in. On the floor, a new portion of canned food had been placed, this time, simple fish with 2 slightly stale slices of bread for each of them. By now, such a ration had become routine, no longer evoking the disgust it once did. Mason and Mia ate but didn't rush to leave the room. Unlike the previous days, this one felt strangely calm and lighter. Mason sat leaning against the wall, while Mia, having finished her portion, placed her plate by the door and returned to him. Both were utterly exhausted, mentally and physically. Thoughts of escape no longer crossed their minds, as even the faintest notion of it brought unbearable pain to their chests. Instead, their thoughts and imaginations were consumed by the events of the previous day. The 2 brutal deaths haunted the teenagers, and they knew they could have intervened in one but hadn't. This weighed heavily on Mia, as the image of the guard at the end of the hallway lingered in her mind. Mason, though less affected by this scene, carried his own burdens. From the first day of their captivity, he had been tormented by guilt. He knew it was his decision that had brought Mia to this place, and he couldn't forgive himself for it. During this time, the teenagers had grown close. It was hard to pinpoint exactly what bound them: affection, true love, or simply the shared events and the instinct to survive by staying together. In truth, they were both grateful for the support they gave each other. It was perhaps the only thing keeping them sane in such a cruel, absurd, and mystically charged situation. Mia often approached Mason, wrapping her arms around him gently and crying softly. Mason never commented during these moments. He would simply hold her in return, waiting patiently for her to calm down. He understood that this was an expression of her emotions, vulnerability, and need for support. For her part, Mia tried to cheer Mason up and repeatedly emphasized that she didn't blame him. June 6th, 2019. Thursday. Another day in the underground domain of the madman, Gabriel, who was obsessed with resurrecting his brother. Mason and Mia had already adapted to this rhythm of life. Their desires had changed, and thoughts of escape had completely vanished. Gabriel, for his part, had stopped assigning new tasks, which the teens were grateful for. But this reprieve didn't last long, as the day arrived when the teenagers faced what would be one of the most terrifying nights of their lives. Gabriel abruptly threw open the door to their room and barked an order. "Today, you have a new task. For one of my experiments, I need soil from a cemetery. You're going to get it." Mason and Mia exchanged frightened glances. The mere thought of a nighttime trip to a cemetery filled them with dread, and the idea of digging up a grave sent waves of panic coursing through them. Meanwhile, the deranged scientist quickly administered injections of the familiar poison, which brought them clarity and a temporary boost of energy. "Here, you'll need this. Now get moving," Gabriel commanded. He tossed Mason's backpack to the ground, which still contained the flashlight from their previous mission and a small trowel. Gabriel stood motionless, pointing toward the tunnel leading to the exit. Mason wanted to say something, but the searing pain in the symbol on his chest silenced him. Without hesitation, the teenagers headed toward the exit. Walking through the deserted outskirts of New Orleans toward the local cemetery, Mason stared at the ground. Once again, they were so close to freedom, yet unable to escape or call for help. The overwhelming sense of powerlessness returned, and anxiety and despair grew with each step. When they reached the cemetery gates, the teens stopped. Mason lifted his head and took in the massive iron gates, beyond which rows of headstones stretched into the darkness. He hesitated for a few moments before finally steeling himself and heading toward the graves. But after only a few steps, he heard hurried footsteps behind him. Turning, Mason saw Mia bolting away from the cemetery. Her sneakers sliced through the tall, overgrown grass. A pang of alarm struck his chest as he stared after her in shock. Step after step, she ran farther until her body suddenly wavered, and she let out a piercing scream before collapsing to the ground. Her cries of anguish echoed for another second before fading into silence. Horrified, Mason raced to Mia. His mind churned with a torrent of thoughts and questions. What happened? Why did she run? Was she trying to escape? Did she see something terrifying? Did she simply trip, or was she gone forever? The last thought frightened Mason the most. He wasn't ready to lose the only person who had supported him through this nightmare, the person he was willing to endure everything for. Reaching Mia, he dropped to his knees and turned her onto her back. She lay there in tears, breathing heavily. A large red stain had spread across the front of her shirt in the chest area. The teenagers lay in the grass, gasping for air. Mia was on the brink, her despair and hopelessness had finally overwhelmed her, prompting her to run mindlessly. Mason, for his part, was at a loss. Until now, Mia had managed to stay composed, but she was now teetering on the edge of hysteria. Not knowing what else to do, Mason gently took Mia's hand and wiped her tears. Surprisingly, it helped somewhat. She stopped sobbing and instead gripped his hand tightly. "Let me do the digging," Mason offered, hoping to spare Mia from further stress. She nodded silently. What happened next passed in a blur for Mason. He couldn't even remember how he made his way deeper into the cemetery, how he located a fresh grave, or how he filled the backpack with soil. In the same fog-like state, he returned to Mia, and hand in hand, they made their way back to the tunnel. Their descent followed the now familiar routine. A few minutes of walking, and the teenagers were back in the laboratory. This time, their return was uneventful. Gabriel was seated at one of the tables, engrossed in studying something. Mason silently approached and placed the backpack beside him. "Ah, yes, good, good," Gabriel muttered, administering the antidote to both of them. "Tonight, there will be another show," he exclaimed gleefully. "I'll call for you." Mia and Mason exchanged emotionless glances. They were ready for whatever twists their fate had in store. June 7th, 2019. Friday. Come now, don't dawdle, or you'll miss everything. I want you to see what we're dealing with, Gabriel said. The teenagers obediently followed Gabriel into the laboratory. This time, the center of the room featured only a single table, beneath which a pentagram had been drawn on the floor with chalk or some other substance. On the table lay a woman, her limbs bound by straps. Unlike the man in the previous experiment, she wasn't connected to any wires and lay motionless, making no effort to resist. Mason and Mia stopped by the wall, holding their breath. Gabriel methodically turned off the lights and began lighting candles positioned at the points of the pentagram. A chill ran down Mia's spine. She could sense that something horrifying was about to happen. Mason tried to appear calm, but the occasional sharp pain from the symbol on his chest reminded him that Gabriel's magic was disturbingly real. The old man pulled a small book from his pocket, opened it, and stood at the head of the restrained woman. His voice unexpectedly cut through the heavy silence that had fallen over the room. He began chanting in the same incomprehensible language he had used during the ritual to carve the symbols. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then, one by one, the candles began to flicker and extinguish. Darkness consumed the room. The air grew oppressively heavy, making it difficult to breathe. Suddenly, a loud, inhuman scream pierced the silence. The scream emanated from the woman on the table. Mia and Mason began trembling uncontrollably, their legs threatening to give out as cold sweat drenched their bodies. The woman continued screaming, thrashing against her restraints as if trying to break free. In the pitch blackness, Mason could see nothing, relying only on his imagination and guesses to interpret what was happening. A cold hand touched his elbow, making him yelp and jerk away. "Mason, it's me." "I'm scared," Mia whispered in a barely audible voice. Mason moved closer to her and held her hand tightly. Gabriel's chanting grew louder, and the woman's screams intensified. Suddenly, a sharp cracking sound echoed through the room, as if bones were breaking. Otherworldly whispers and groans filled the space, seeming to emanate from the very walls. How long this horror lasted was impossible to say. Mason and Mia snapped out of their daze only when the room was flooded with the harsh yellow light of an old wall-mounted lamp. The sight before them was one they would never forget. The woman's twisted body lay on the table, her limbs bent at unnatural angles, still convulsing slightly. Gabriel closed his book and walked over to a rolling cart holding a control panel. With the push of a button, the straps securing the woman's body released, and she fell lifelessly to the floor. Terror gripped Mason and Mia as they realized what had happened. In the oppressive darkness, Gabriel had seemingly managed to momentarily place a soul into the woman's body. Whether the experiment had succeeded was unclear, as the body now appeared lifeless. Gabriel looked at the teenagers. "You see, for a brief moment, I was able to place my brother's soul into this vessel. Just a little more refinement, and he will live again. Through magic and electrical impulses, I'll be able to house his soul and make the body function. But I need more experiments, ones you won't see." His final words made it clear that Gabriel no longer wished for the teens to be present. Without hesitation, they returned to their room. Their minds were clouded. The recent events had left a traumatic impact on both Mason and Mia, affecting them physically and psychologically. The hope of escaping this nightmare had long since abandoned them, and the constant horrors they witnessed threatened to drive them mad. The only source of solace amidst this chaos was the bond they shared. Their emotional connection continued to grow, and their mutual support remained strong, providing a small but vital beacon of comfort in an otherwise unrelenting nightmare. June 9th, 2019. Saturday. Waking up to the loud slam of a door, Mia jolted upright. The room was dark, and she hadn't fully shaken off the haze of sleep. She called out for Mason, but there was no answer. He's probably asleep, she thought, and began feeling around the mattress for him. But their makeshift bed was empty. A chilling realization hit Mia, snapping her into full wakefulness. "Mason, Are you here? Hello, answer me, she pleaded desperately, but her voice echoed off the cold, unfeeling walls. Mia began searching the room, running her hands along the walls and crisscrossing the space blindly. Mason was nowhere to be found, which could only mean one thing: Gabriel had taken him. Could he really have chosen Mason for the next experiment? Mia couldn't believe it. They had been through so much together, supporting each other through every terrifying moment, and now she was alone, left in the darkness with nothing but anxiety and dread. After pacing the room for the 5th time, Mia slumped back onto the mattress and began to cry softly. Memories of her time with Mason flooded her mind. Their first meeting in early childhood, the evening he had invited her over and taught her how to play chess, their first exploration of the sealed-off apartment building, the time they investigated that eerie abandoned apartment, their first innocent kiss on the cheek in a basement, and the unwavering support he had given her during these horrific days. The memories only made her feel worse. Her sense of stability had vanished completely, replaced by an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. She couldn't bear to think about what Gabriel might do to Mason, or what the madman's twisted imagination might have planned for her. Mia's thoughts were interrupted by a distant scream. Through the heavy doors, she couldn't make out whose voice it was. It was definitely a man, but was it Mason's? She couldn't tell. That night, Mia barely slept. The constant sense of fear, the gnawing uncertainty, and the dread that Gabriel might burst through the door at any moment kept her wide awake, her heart pounding relentlessly. June 10th, 2019. Sunday. Mia couldn't sleep. She lay awake, waiting for Gabriel's inevitable entrance, so the sharp creak of the door, though sudden, didn't catch her off guard. She squinted as the flashlight beam landed on her face. "Come on. There's one last task for you," Gabriel said flatly. A cold dread settled in Mia's chest. Another task, and this time, she would be alone without Mason. What would it entail? Could she handle it on her own? Worse, what if it was related to Mason? What if she had to hurt him? Her thoughts spiraled, preventing her from focusing. She followed Gabriel as he shuffled down the corridor. "Over the past few days, I've come so close to achieving my goal," Gabriel began. "I'm ready to conduct the final ritual to bring my brother back. But for that, I need life energy. As you might have guessed, young people have the most of it. But you and your boyfriend alone aren't enough." Mia's head swam. He'd said they wouldn't be killed, yet here he was, talking about harvesting life energy from them. And worst of all, she still didn't know if Mason was even alive. These questions gnawed at her, but she didn't dare ask. When they reached the end of the hallway, Gabriel opened the door to the main room, revealing another unsettling sight. The table in the center was still there, with a pentagram drawn on the floor beneath it. Surrounding the pentagram were 3 large metal chairs, each connected to a control panel off to the side by a series of wires. Mason was slumped in one of the chairs, unconscious. His head lolled to the side, and his arms were strapped down by metal clamps. A surge of mixed emotions flooded Mia. She wanted to rush to him but stopped herself. By now, she fully understood that the symbol on her chest controlled her every action. This realization was so ingrained that the thought of acting without Gabriel's permission didn't even cross her mind. "You see, Mia," Gabriel said, gesturing to the setup, "one chair is already occupied. The second one is for you. But the third? It's empty. That's where you come in. You need to bring me one more subject. It has to be someone your age. Don't worry, though. I've already decided who. Remember Ryan?" Ryan was an old friend of Mia's. A mischievous kid from the neighborhood, he was always trying to impress her with his reckless antics and faux bravery. It was no secret he had a crush on her. "This time, I'll give you a phone," Gabriel said, handing her a familiar device. "You'll call him and ask him to meet you. Get him to follow you inside. That's all you need to do." Gabriel's voice was devoid of emotion as he laid out the plan. He handed Mia her smartphone and, without warning, injected her with another dose of poison. The familiar rush of energy and clarity swept over her, and Mia headed for the exit. Within minutes, she was standing in the woods just outside the house. Pressing the phone's power button, the symbol on her chest throbbed faintly. She glanced at the time, 12:30 a.m. With trembling fingers, Mia found Ryan's number and pressed the call button. The ringing seemed to stretch on forever. As it did, the gravity of what she was about to do sank in. She was about to lure an innocent boy, someone willing to do anything for her, into a trap. A trap that could very well be the end of him. The internal conflict between her humanity and her fear of Gabriel grew with each passing ring. Finally, a groggy voice answered. "Hello? Mia, is that really you?" "Yes, Ryan," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm lost. I'm in the woods near our neighborhood. Can you come get me and walk me home?" Her face flushed with shame as she realized how brazenly she was deceiving someone she cared about. "Why yeah, of course. I'm getting dressed and heading out now," Ryan said quickly, ending the call without asking any questions. Mia began walking toward the neighborhood, her mind clouded with guilt and despair. The cool night air and the rustle of grass beneath her feet lulled her into a trance-like state. Her thoughts consumed her, and the weight of the betrayal she was about to commit settled heavily in her chest. The streets were empty, save for the occasional car or passerby, reminding her that she was still in the real world. Escape wasn't an option she considered anymore. She had long since accepted the hopelessness of her situation and the fact that she was now a pawn in Gabriel's twisted game. After a while, she saw a figure rushing toward her. It was Ryan, running to meet her. The symbol on her chest suddenly burned, a sharp reminder that she had to lure him into the building without arousing suspicion. "Mia, are you okay? Oh my God, you're all dirty. What happened to you? Everyone's been looking for you and Mason for over a week," Ryan exclaimed, his voice full of concern. "We got lost in the woods," Mia replied hesitantly. "I found my way back, but I don't know where Mason is." "That's awful, but I'm just glad you're safe. Come on, let's get you home," he said, taking her arm gently as they walked. As they made their way, Ryan bombarded Mia with questions, trying to piece together what had happened. She deflected them all, claiming she felt unwell and avoiding any real answers. When they reached the building, the courtyard and playground were eerily empty. It was late at night, and no one else was around. "Can you help me to the elevator?" Mia asked. "Of course," Ryan replied without hesitation. Steps. A thud. A body hit the ground. Mia gasped and turned around. Mason stood behind Ryan, holding a heavy wooden stick. "Mason, you're alive," she cried, throwing her arms around him. Relief and warmth flooded her as she clung to him. "I was so worried about you." "It's okay, Mia. But we don't have time for this. We need to drag him to Gabriel before he wakes up," Mason said firmly. The two teenagers grabbed Ryan by the arms and began dragging his unconscious body toward the basement. When they returned to the laboratory, Gabriel was in the middle of moving his brother's corpse onto the table. The decomposed body dripped with formaldehyde, leaving slimy, grotesque streaks on the pentagram. The deranged old man was breathing heavily but carried out the task with a strange determination. Once the corpse was secured with straps, Gabriel turned to the teens. "Bring him here," he ordered, pointing to one of the chairs. The burning pain in the symbols on Mia and Mason's chests flared up so intensely that their vision blurred. Without a word, they obeyed, placing Ryan in the designated chair. Gabriel raised his hand, and the pain intensified. The teenagers collapsed to the floor, losing consciousness. When they came to, they found themselves strapped into the metal chairs surrounding the pentagram. Heavy clamps held their arms and legs in place, and adhesive pads connected copper wires to their shoulders and arms, linking them to the corpse. All the wires fed into the control panel, where Gabriel stood, his face alight with a twisted anticipation. "Tonight, you will witness the culmination of all my work," Gabriel said, his voice trembling with excitement. "For decades, I have devoted myself to this moment. I will finally bring my brother back to life. And you, foolish children, will share your life energy with him." Without hesitation, Gabriel pressed a series of buttons and began chanting. Electric currents surged through the teens' bodies, causing them to convulse and scream in agony. Gabriel's voice grew louder as he recited his incantation, while thick smoke and dust began to fill the room. The pentagram glowed an intense red, and shadows flitted along the walls. Otherworldly whispers and moans blended with the teenagers' cries, creating a symphony of terror. Suddenly, the corpse twitched. Its fingers curled, and its shoulders jerked. The symbols carved into Mia and Mason's chests burned like fire as they felt their life force being drained. Meanwhile, Gabriel's voice weakened, the ritual taking a toll on him. He collapsed to his knees, rasping out the final words of his spell. The lights on the control panel flickered, turning from orange to red. The room became a vortex of chaos and malevolence. The corpse let out a loud, guttural scream, sending a wave of fear through the teens, who were on the verge of losing consciousness. The red light on the control panel exploded, showering the room with shards of glass. Wires sparked and snapped, and the room plunged into darkness. Gabriel lay motionless on the floor, muttering incoherently. The otherworldly cries grew louder as the pentagram's glow intensified, illuminating the chaos in brief, blinding flashes. The overwhelming physical and psychological strain was too much for the teens. Within moments, they both blacked out, followed shortly by Ryan, who had remained unconscious since the start of the ritual. Time passed, though how much was unclear. Mason was the first to awaken. He found himself lying on the cold concrete floor near his chair. Across the pentagram, Mia and Ryan lay motionless, their bodies occasionally twitching from residual electrical surges. Mason surveyed the room. The corpse lay on the table, charred where the wires had been attached. It was still. Near the control panel, Gabriel's lifeless body sprawled on the ground. Whether he was alive or dead was unclear, but his power was gone. Mason struggled to his feet, his limbs heavy and numb. Slowly. June 11th, 2019. Monday. Morning came unexpectedly and anxiously for Mason. He woke to the rising noise around him. Squinting his eyes open, he saw a crowd gathering nearby. In the early sunlight, the flashing blue lights of ambulances and police cars stood out sharply. Mason rubbed his eyes and looked around. Mia was already on a stretcher, being wheeled toward an ambulance. Ryan lay unconscious nearby. Paramedics moved swiftly, performing their tasks, while police officers examined the building and scribbled notes on the trunk of their squad car. Passers-by whispered among themselves, horrified and commenting on the scene. Before Mason realized it, he was on a gurney himself, being loaded into another ambulance where medics began a preliminary examination. Mason's mind was foggy, struggling to process what was happening. Then, a sudden thought jolted him. The basement. There's a secret lab. A crazy old man, victims' bodies, some kind of dark magic. Mason blurted out frantically. The medics exchanged concerned glances, dismissing it as the ramblings of psychological trauma. However, the police took Mason's words seriously. A team of armed officers in tactical gear headed into the building. At the hospital, Mason was placed in the same room as Mia, just as he'd hoped. Ryan wasn't there, his condition appeared more severe, requiring additional care. By midday, Mia stirred and looked over at Mason. "You're alive?" "Seems like it," he replied softly, turning toward her on his gurney. "You?" "Yeah. What was all that?" "I don't know, but I don't want to think about it right now." Suddenly, the door to their room opened, and in rushed Mason's worried parents and Mia's mother. For the next half hour, there were tears, hugs, and heartfelt words. It was clear that during the teens' disappearance, their parents had nearly lost hope of seeing them again. The reunion was deeply emotional. Mia's mom bustled between the two kids, hugging them, kissing their foreheads, asking how they felt, and offering water, doing everything she could to comfort them. Mason's father sat at the head of his bed, quietly weeping as he held his son's hand. Mason had never seen such raw emotion from his usually stoic, serious father. The sight tightened something in Mason's chest, and though everything had ended relatively well, he felt an overwhelming urge to cry too. Mia, on the other hand, was the first to let her emotions flow as soon as she saw her mother. Mason's father explained that it was Evelyn, the neighbor who lived in Mia's building, who found them. Early in the morning, she'd been heading out on errands when she spotted the dirty, gaunt, unconscious teens lying on the ground outside. "What about Ryan?" Mia asked, her voice tinged with guilt. The weight of responsibility still pressed heavily on her. "He's in a medically induced coma," Mia's mom explained. "The doctors said his body couldn't handle the strain, so they're keeping him stable for now. But the initial prognosis is positive. They think he has a strong chance of recovery." After some time, the door opened again, and the head doctor entered. He gently asked the parents to step out, explaining that the patients needed rest. Once the door closed, the doctor pulled up a chair between their beds. "I won't take up much of your time, you need peace right now. I just wanted to thank you." Mason's claims were verified. The police uncovered the underground lab. "The details will come later, but I can assure you the danger is over." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "You'll both need time to recover, physically and emotionally. Therapy will be a crucial part of that, and I'll help arrange everything." The doctor reached into his pocket and handed them 2 pamphlets. The covers featured images of serene forests, cozy cabins, and children playing outdoors. "This is Camp Haven," he explained. "After your discharge, I highly recommend you spend some time there. The trip is already covered by sponsors, so the choice is yours. For now, focus on resting." He stood, gave them a reassuring smile, and quietly left the room, closing the door behind him. June 25, 2019. Tuesday. 2 weeks had passed since the teenager's nightmare ended. Today, Mia, Mason, and Ryan were heading to Camp Haven, a restorative summer camp. Mason stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at the large scar that spanned much of his chest. From the first day, it had refused to heal, only beginning to close after Gabriel's powers were severed during the failed experiment. He gazed at the scar, knowing it would stay with him forever, a permanent reminder of the horrors he'd endured and the courage he'd summoned. A few houses away, Mia sat in her apartment. She and her mom were sharing tea in the kitchen. After the harrowing ordeal, her mother had changed jobs. The new position paid less, but it gave her more time to spend with Mia. The bags were already packed, and they were waiting for the shuttle bus driver, who was scheduled to pick them up near their building. As for Ryan, he no longer spoke to Mia, Mason, or anyone in their neighborhood group. Despite being unconscious for most of the ordeal, fragmented memories of his brief moments of wakefulness had left a profound impact on his psyche. The events had also fostered a deep mistrust of others, particularly Mia, whom he now regarded with resentment. Half an hour later, Mia's phone buzzed. It was the shuttle driver, letting her know he was waiting. Her mom kissed her goodbye, wished her a pleasant trip and recovery, and closed the door behind her. Mason, Mia, and Ryan met near the bus almost simultaneously. All 3 looked weary but were ready for a fresh start. Mia wore a high-neck sweater despite the summer heat. The scar on her chest made her self-conscious, and she wasn't ready for open clothing yet. Ryan arrived with only a small backpack. He was silent, didn't greet them, and avoided eye contact with Mia before boarding the bus to take his seat. Mason, on the other hand, was beaming. His emotional state had stabilized, and the trip to a distant camp with the girl of his dreams felt like a gift from fate. They greeted each other with a warm hug before boarding the bus as well. That evening, Mia and Mason sat on the veranda of one of the camp buildings. The air had grown cooler, so Mason fetched a blanket and, upon returning, sat closer to her. The two teenagers watched the sunset, embracing and savoring the moment. Ahead lay an entire month of rest, recovery, and cherished time together. They spoke about abstract topics, occasionally touching on their shared past experiences. Both felt deeply grateful for the support they'd given each other. After one of Mia's remarks, Mason leaned closer. Their eyes met, and they shared a passionate kiss. That evening marked the beginning of a new chapter in their relationship and a fresh adventure at Camp Haven.